Welcome to History for Sleep. If this video found you late at night while you were scrolling and maybe fighting off a little insomnia, or maybe you're one of the loyal night owls who always come back, well, I'm glad you're here. Before we get started, I'd love to know something simple. Where are you listening from? Maybe you're somewhere warm and breezy, or curled up under a thick blanket in a cold little room. Wherever you are, drop it in the comments below. It's always lovely seeing where this quiet little community is tuning in from. And hey, if you find this kind of slow, deep dive, soothing history relaxing, consider giving the video a thumbs up. Maybe subscribing so you won't miss the next one. It helps more than you know, and it's totally free. All right, let's take a deep breath together. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Now let's dim the lights, maybe get your favorite pillow in place and dive into a long, slow, almost dreamlike journey into the past. Tonight, we're stepping back into a time that feels impossibly far away, but still eerily familiar in some ways. This is segment 1 of our Cathar story, and we're calling it Why You Wouldn't Last a Day as a Cathar Peasant. So, let's begin. Chikiuha, you wake up before dawn, not from a buzzing alarm clock, not because you had a to-do list or some meeting, but because the cold inside your one-room home has reached that special kind of sharpness that nudges the body awake. The fire burned out hours ago. There's frost on your blanket, and your breath hangs in the air. You rub your eyes and sit up slowly, bones already sore from the straw mattress you've slept on since childhood. You're not in a village full of stone towers or sweeping medieval drama. No knights clanking by on horses, no glittering courts. You live on a steep hill somewhere in the Languedoc countryside, southern France. It's the early 1200s, give or take. The earth is rocky, the winter's harsh, and the summer heat can split your lips wide open if you're not careful. There's no soap, no toilet, no days off. And this is your life every single day. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever gone weeks without washing, but you still had to go out and interact with people? Ever tried to fall asleep while your stomach growled so loud it echoed in your own ears? Or tried to do hard physical labor with a pounding headache and no aspirin in sight? That's not a rare day for a Cathar peasant, it's the average. You'd probably call this surviving. But here, it's just called living. You get dressed, if you can even call it that. You wrap a rough wool tunic around your body and tug on boots that barely hold together anymore. You've repaired them with bits of leather you cut from your old belt. Your hands are cracked, dirt is permanently tucked under your fingernails, and your back already aches from the work you know is coming. Your first stop is the animal pen because animals don't wait. The family goat might be giving birth today. The chickens need to be fed, and your half-blind father is counting on you to collect whatever eggs the foxes didn't get overnight. You whisper a quick prayer, not to the Catholic God, but something softer, quieter, something you don't even speak aloud. Maybe you're hoping the spirit world sees your struggle. Maybe you're just whispering out of habit. Because you are a Cathar, and that means your soul doesn't belong to this world, it belongs to the world of light. But you're still stuck in a body. And this body, it's hungry, cold, exhausted. So, you do what all peasants do. You carry on. Now here's the thing they don't usually tell you in history class. Being a Cathar didn't make your daily life any easier. In fact, it might have made it harder. You didn't get special privileges. You didn't go around preaching like a monk on a mountaintop. You were just a regular person trying to keep your family fed, while quietly holding on to a belief system that was considered dangerous, heretical, even punishable by death. Let me ask, could you keep that kind of secret for your entire life? Could you whisper your truth only in safe company, never knowing if the neighbor who shared bread with you yesterday might report you tomorrow? That's what it meant to be a Cathar peasant in this world. You cook a bit of porridge, barley or maybe chestnut flour if you're lucky, and chew slowly, your teeth already worn down from years of coarse bread. You don't talk much in the morning. Your family knows the rhythm. Words are saved for later, for when there's time to rest, which honestly isn't often. Once the animals are fed and the tools are checked, it's time to head to the fields. If you're a man, you're tilling rocky soil, trying to pull life out of dirt that barely wants to give. If you're a woman, you're hauling water, washing clothes in icy streams, caring for children, spinning thread, making soap from ashes and animal fat. The gender divide here is deep, but not in the way you might think. Among Cathars, women were respected more than in Catholic communities. Some even became perfects, spiritual leaders. But out here, in the dust and hunger of the peasant class, respect doesn't mean comfort. It means working until your body feels like a heap of broken twigs. There's this myth that medieval life was simple, peaceful, that everyone had a role and things just flowed. But that's a fantasy. Life was unstable. Storms ruined crops. Lords raised taxes on a whim. Disease swept through and didn't care whether you prayed to the Pope or to the God of Light. And yet somehow people held on. You might gather at night with a few others when the moon is high and the chickens are finally quiet. You sit in a circle, maybe inside a barn or near a grove of trees, far from the village priest's watchful eyes. There's no candle, maybe just the soft orange glow of embers. Someone speaks in Occitan, not Latin, not French, the language of your mother and her mother before her. They tell a parable, maybe about a lost soul finding its way through the false world of the flesh, and you listen. Not with your ears really, but with something deeper. You feel it like warmth rising in your chest. It's hard to describe, isn't it? That feeling when something sounds like truth, even if you don't fully understand it. Cathars believed this life was a trap, a place the soul had to pass through before returning to the true spiritual world. They didn't think your soul was born in sin. They thought it was born in light, and then kidnapped by the material world. That's why you suffer. That's why this life feels so heavy. They weren't saying suffering was your fault. They were saying the entire system was broken. Think about how radical that is. The church said, obey, confess, pay your tithe, and maybe you'll get to heaven. The Cathars said, no. Heaven isn't a reward. It's your home. You've just forgotten the way back. Now imagine holding that belief while your neighbor goes to church every Sunday, praises the Pope, and glares at you for skipping Mass. Imagine keeping your truth hidden for decades, while inquisitors start arriving in nearby towns. Imagine being 12 years old and overhearing your parents whisper about someone who disappeared last night. Maybe they were a perfect, maybe just a sympathizer. Either way, they're gone. What would that do to your sense of safety? Could you live with that kind of quiet fear every day? Someone you maybe saw just last week, pulling a cart or mending a fence, is suddenly gone. No funeral, no goodbye, just gone. And the thing is, they weren't a criminal. They didn't steal anything, they didn't hurt anyone. As far as you know, all they did was believe something different. Maybe they thought the church had lost its way. Maybe they didn't want to kneel in a cathedral built on taxes scraped from starving hands. Now let me ask you something. If you grew up like that, wouldn't your heart learn how to be quiet? Wouldn't you learn to smile politely, keep your head down, and tuck your real thoughts somewhere deep where no one could reach them? That's what life is like for a Cathar peasant. There are no grand speeches, no rebellion, just the slow daily work of survival and the quiet commitment to a truth you can't say aloud. Your days are long, and every season brings its own kind of struggle. In the spring, there's planting. Hours spent hunched over furrows, pushing seeds into the cold earth, hoping the frost is finally done. You worry about your tools breaking. You worry about rain not coming. You worry about rain coming too much. But you can't afford to dwell, you just work. That's the rhythm. Summer brings heat, biting flies, and sweat that burns your eyes. You wrap cloth around your head, try to drink enough water, and pray your crops don't wilt in the midday sun. And by the way, this water, it's not clean. It's a shared well or maybe a nearby stream where the animals also drink. Sometimes the water smells a little off. Sometimes it makes you sick, but you drink it anyway. Because what choice do you have? Then there's autumn, the harvest. If things went well, you gather what little food the land has given you. Wheat, barley, maybe some olives or chestnuts if you live in the hills. You dry some of it, grind some into flour, and store it carefully, knowing that winter is coming. And oh, winter. Winter in the Languedoc can be surprisingly harsh. The winds cut through even the thickest tunics and snow blocks mountain paths. You patch your roof again using branches and packed mud, but it still leaks. You stay indoors more, huddled close to your family, sharing warmth and trying to stretch what little you have. Now picture this. It's late December, and your family has just shared a thin soup. There's barely any meat, just boiled turnips, a few herbs, maybe a sliver of dried fish. You're wrapped in every layer you own. Your feet are numb, and you're trying to sleep while your stomach aches from hunger. Would you last a single night like that without complaining, without panicking? Be honest. This is why we say, you wouldn't last a day. But for a Cathar peasant, there's no room for despair. Life is suffering, yes, but suffering isn't the end of the story. It's just a stage. Because remember, they believed this body, this aching, freezing, hungry thing, wasn't the real you. The real you was something brighter, something weightless and divine. This life was just a temporary imprisonment, a shadow world. And that belief, it doesn't make the cold go away. It doesn't fix the hunger. But it does something else. It helps you hold on. Let's talk for a second about faith. Not the kind you're forced to memorize in a church, but the kind that keeps you going when you're alone in the dark. What does that look like for you? For the Cathar peasant, it looked like a small gathering. Nothing grand. Maybe 3 or 4 people sitting in a low house, the shutters drawn, voices barely above a whisper. Someone reads from a book, maybe not even aloud, just with their finger tracing lines of faded ink. They don't have printed Bibles. They don't even call themselves heretics. They don't shout. They don't demand. They wait. They listen. They believe. They believe the world was made not by a good God, but by a lesser, corrupt force. That suffering was proof, not punishment. Proof that this world was a false copy of the true realm. Now that's a wild idea, isn't it? What if the world really was a trap? What if everything from hunger to war to sickness wasn't random or divine punishment, but part of a design meant to confuse you? It might sound crazy at first, But if you were living in filth and hunger, if the official church was building cathedrals with gold while your baby died from fever, wouldn't you at least consider the possibility? Cathars believed in two gods, not one. A god of good, pure spirit, light, love, and a god of evil, the ruler of the material world. They didn't see wealth as a blessing. They saw it as a shackle. They didn't fear death. They feared forgetting. So every day as you haul water, break bread, sweep the dirt floor, tend to your child's cough, you do so with one eye on the eternal. You don't pray for riches. You pray for clarity, for the strength to resist temptation, for the wisdom to see through the illusion. And in your village, that illusion is everywhere. Let's imagine for a moment that it's Sunday. The local Catholic priest is holding Mass. He rides in on a horse, wears clean robes, speaks in Latin, a language none of the peasants understand. He blesses bread and wine, recites something about salvation, and reminds everyone to tithe. You go, you have to. Skipping church is suspicious, and if anyone even thinks you're a Cathar, you could be reported. So you sit quietly, you make the sign of the cross, you lower your head when you're supposed to, but in your heart, you're somewhere else entirely. You're thinking of the hills, of that little stone house where your friend shared the consolamentum with you, the one sacred Cathar ritual that washes away worldly desires. You're thinking of your uncle, who died peacefully last year, refusing food and water in the final days of his endura, the fast before death that would release his soul from this prison of flesh. He was ready. He wasn't afraid. He knew he was going home. Could you face death with that kind of calm? Now don't get me wrong. This isn't to say Cathars didn't feel pain. They did. Every day. They grieved. They feared. But they also believed those emotions were temporary, part of the illusion. And when you live in poverty long enough, when your life is stripped down to its bare bones, no mirrors, no comforts, no distractions, sometimes it's that belief in something greater that keeps the soul from shattering. But let's shift a little, because belief alone doesn't put food on the table. You still have mouths to feed. Maybe you have children. Maybe your partner is sick. You don't have a doctor. You have herbs, prayers, and the help of a midwife or healer who learned everything from experience and superstition. You barter with neighbors. You trade wool for eggs, bread for firewood, help fixing a fence for a few onions. Money? It's rare. Sometimes you use a few coins, but mostly it's goods, services, trust. Do you have neighbors you trust like that? People you know would come help if your roof collapsed in a storm, because for a Cathar peasant, community wasn't optional, it was survival. And the strange part is, despite all the fear, despite the Inquisition looming just over the horizon, despite the hunger and the sickness and the endless labor, there's something strangely peaceful about it. Your world is small, but it's also full of rhythm. Wake, work, gather, listen. Pray not to be noticed, pray not to betray your soul, live simply, speak softly, die cleanly. That's the hope. So if you're still with me, and I hope you are, let's take one more slow, careful step into the Cathar world. You've walked through the hunger. You've learned the rhythms. You've seen how simple faith might just be the only thing that makes the pain of daily life bearable. But here's something we haven't talked about yet, and it's important. It's the part that really forces us to ask, could any of us really live like this? What happens when the illusion of safety breaks? You see, for a Cathar peasant, There's always a second life being lived in secret. A hidden world behind the chores, behind the smiles, behind the quiet, "Yes, Father," when the village priest asks how your soul is doing. There's the spoken world, and then there's the real one, the one you're protecting in whispers and candlelight. And that's exhausting, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. Can you imagine that? Never being able to be fully yourself in public? Never knowing if someone you trust might turn on you, not because they want to, but because they are afraid to? Let's go back to your little home, the stone one, the one with the roof patched by straw and mud in your own hands. Inside it's dark except for the glow of the fire and the sweet, bitter scent of rosemary drying on the beam above your hearth. Your neighbor knocks on the door. You stiffen, not because you don't like him, but because lately he's been acting strange, shorter with his words, avoiding eye contact. You're wondering, does he suspect? Did someone say something? You open the door with your best relaxed smile. You make small talk about the cold weather, about how the well nearly froze last night, about how the mule in the next town got loose again, and all the while, your thoughts are racing. Is he here for you? Is he here because of you? And the worst part? You don't know. You won't know until it's too late. Because once the rumors start, once someone even breathes the word Cathar in connection to your name, it's over. You might be dragged in for questioning. You might be tortured. And even if you say everything they want to hear, even if you name others to save yourself, they still might burn you anyway. So you do the only thing that makes sense. You act like nothing's wrong, like you're just another tired, hungry, cold peasant. But inside you're doing calculus. Every gesture, every word, every silence. You know how some people talk about social anxiety now, like how tiring it is to wear a mask in public? Now imagine that anxiety meant life or death. How long would you last? Would your voice shake when asked to recite a prayer you don't believe in? Would your eyes dart when someone mentions the bishop? Would you speak too little and make people suspicious, or too much and reveal yourself by accident? This is the part of Cathar life that's hard to truly understand unless you sit in it for a while. It's not the hunger that breaks you, or the cold, or the work. It's the silence. It's the knowing you can't ever fully exhale around anyone, except maybe your own family. But let's pull back a bit. I don't want this to sound like there was no joy, because even in the hardest times, people laugh. They sing. They fall in love. They find beauty in tiny places. And for Cathar peasants, joy was a kind of resistance. There are stories, quiet ones, not the kind you find in royal chronicles, of couples walking through almond orchards in springtime, letting their fingers brush as they pass through blooming trees. There are evenings when someone in the village brings out a lute, plays a soft tune, and everyone hums along. No lyrics, just the music, the moment. Sometimes a neighbor bakes a bit of extra bread and shares it. Sometimes an older woman tells stories from when she was young, about how even then people were being accused of heresy, and how somehow they survived. You ever listen to your grandmother tell the same story for the 5th time, but this time it feels different? There's a certain softness to it now, a kind of weight. That's what those stories were like. They were anchors, reassurances that even in hard times people held on. So let me ask you again, can you see yourself there now, sitting under a cracked wooden beam, holding a bowl of lentil stew that's more water than anything, with steam curling up into your face? Can you feel the quiet warmth, the dull ache in your shoulders? The hush of a home where everyone speaks a little softer than they really want to. That's not drama. That's not fiction. That was life. And it's in this quiet, tender repetition of simple acts, gathering firewood, repairing sandals, feeding goats, that a Cathar peasant's soul was shaped. But don't think the outside world left them alone for long, because something was coming. You probably know the word already: Inquisition. Even saying it out loud feels heavy, doesn't it? Like something sharp is hiding behind the syllables. The Inquisition didn't sweep in all at once. It started slowly, with murmurs, papal messengers, local lords receiving letters sealed in wax, monks arriving with questions, and those questions never felt harmless. Because they didn't ask, "Are you a Cathar?" They asked, "Do you know anyone who might be? Have you heard anything unusual? For who doesn't come to church as often as they should?" And just like that, your community, your one fragile line of defense, starts to fray. No one wants to answer, but no one wants to be next either. Can you imagine that level of fear? Can you imagine watching your neighbor be taken away, and then just a few days later his wife starts talking a little louder, laughing a little too easily, bringing extra bread to mass as if trying to prove something? You want to believe she's just being generous, but in your gut, you feel it, she's afraid. And maybe she has reason to be, because the Inquisition didn't just punish belief, it punished suspicion. The church wanted loyalty, and it didn't care how it got it. Confession under duress? Good enough. Accusations from a child? That counted too. Even dreams could be used as evidence. So now you wake up every day wondering, not if someone will be taken, but who. It might be you, or your brother, or the old woman who helped you with herbs last spring. But no matter what, you keep going. You tend your fields. You whisper prayers to the true God of spirit and light. You teach your children to do the same, but carefully, quietly. Maybe you say it's just a song. Maybe you say it's just a game. Because what else can you do? You survive, and that's the heart of it. Being a Cathar peasant wasn't about rebellion. It wasn't about fire and sword and martyrdom. That came later. What it meant, what it really meant, was learning how to carry a truth so gently that it didn't crack under the weight of fear. It meant knowing that everything around you, from the wealth of the church to the misery of the poor, was part of a broken design, and that the only real power you had was to resist it quietly, through kindness, through humility, through the daily refusal to give up your soul. And in that resistance, soft, invisible, and stubbornly hopeful, there was something beautiful, something enduring. So I'll ask you one last time in this segment, do you think you would have lasted a day? Or would your heart have broken at the silence, at the suspicion, at the coldness of a world that told you your soul was dangerous? I don't know, but I do know this. The Cathar peasants didn't just last a day, they lasted generations. And even when the church came down on them with fire and chains and blood, their memory didn't disappear, their stories didn't vanish, because even the quietest lives leave echoes. And that's where we'll pause our journey through daily life. You've been walking with them, breathing with them, seeing what they saw. Now it's time to shift our focus, because in the next segment, coming up in just a bit, we'll take a closer look at a turning point, a real moment in time, a fortress in the mountains, a siege that changed everything, a place called Montségur. So if you're still with me, If your eyes are getting heavy but your curiosity's still holding on, maybe now's the time to lie back, close your eyes, and let your mind drift into that old stone village one last time. Because our story is only just beginning. Now, before we drift deeper into the next chapter of this story, let's pause for a quick moment. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Maybe you're curled up in bed in a small apartment in Manila. Maybe you're out in the countryside in France or a cozy corner of Canada. Wherever you are, go ahead, let me know in the comments. I actually read them. I really do. And if this video is helping you relax or just giving you something thoughtful to fall asleep to, maybe consider liking and subscribing. That way, the algorithm knows this kind of quiet history is something people want more of. Something you want more of. Alright, are you settled in, got your blanket, maybe a soft pillow behind your head? Good. Because this part of the story, it's heavier, but it's also gripping and strangely beautiful. Quietly tragic, like watching a candle flicker out in a dark room. This is segment 2. We're calling it The Fall of Montségur. And it's a very different kind of story than the one we told in segment 1. If that was about the slow struggle of everyday life, this one's about a single moment, a siege, a stand, a final breath. But don't worry, we're still keeping everything soft, slow, and low. Think of this not as a war story, but as a memory, a fading one. So, here we go. Let's begin at the base of a mountain. It's early morning, but the mist is already thinning out. The sun is climbing gently and it's catching the edge of the fortress up on the cliff. Montségur. Have you heard of it before? Maybe just vaguely. It's not as famous as the castles of England or the pyramids of Egypt, but for the Cathars, it was sacred, a refuge, a last hope, and for a while, it worked. Let's go back to the 1240s. At this point, the Cathars had been hunted, persecuted, and burned for decades. Their villages were watched, their books were burned, their perfecti, the spiritual guides, were rounded up and executed. So they retreated, upward, higher, into the mountains, and Montségur, perched almost like a dream, became their sanctuary. Now I want you to picture it. Close your eyes for a moment if you want to. Imagine a steep, narrow ridge, surrounded on all sides by plunging cliffs. At the very top, a fortress, sturdy, simple, and quiet. The stone is warm in the sun, but icy cold at night. It's not luxurious, but it's safe. And that's what mattered. For the Cathars who made it up here, it felt like breathing again, like being close to heaven. There were families, fighters, perfecti, children. Even some nobles who had secretly supported the Cathars joined them there, and for a time, it worked. From above, they could see everything: the rolling hills, the winding roads, any approaching danger. And for a while, the Catholic Church, though furious, couldn't touch them. You ever felt that sense of calm after running from something? That deep exhale when you realize you might actually be okay? That's what Montségur was. A breath, a pause. But of course, pauses don't last. The Church never forgets. Not in those days. By 1243, they'd had enough. The Pope demanded action. The French crown, eager to prove its loyalty, sent troops, thousands of them. And so, the siege began. Picture this: hundreds of heavily armed knights and soldiers at the bottom of the mountain, camps set up, fires burning at night, drums, Orders barked, horses tethered, tents filled with men sharpening blades, and at the top, maybe 200 people, maybe a bit more, including women, children, the elderly, and a few dozen fighters with nothing left to lose. Would you be scared? Would you try to run? Or would you stand with the only people who ever made you feel like you mattered? Because the people at Montségur, they chose to stay. For 9 long months, the siege dragged on. And here's the thing. This wasn't some epic battle with flaming catapults and charging knights. It wasn't glamorous, it was slow, cold, claustrophobic. The people trapped in the fortress were running out of food. Water had to be rationed. People got sick. Supplies were scarce. Letters, if they made it down the mountain at all, had to be carried by stealthy messengers, risking death each time. Every morning, the people inside woke up knowing the enemy was still there, still waiting, still watching. Can you imagine that? Living each day with the knowledge that death was just waiting at the bottom of the hill? It messes with your mind. Mothers told their children bedtime stories. The perfecti held silent prayers. People made soup from herbs and roots. They comforted one another, and deep inside they hoped for a miracle. But the miracle didn't come. And one day the soldiers at the base got smart. They climbed the side of the mountain the Cathars thought was too steep to be attacked. Slowly, carefully, they built ladders, they scaled it, and suddenly, Montségur was surrounded from above and below, no way out. Still, the Cathars didn't surrender, not right away. They held on, they clung to hope. Maybe they believed the world would change, that God would intervene, that justice would find them, but it didn't. And in March of 1244, the inevitable happened. The defenders surrendered. The church agreed not to kill everyone, only those who refused to repent, only those who stayed true to the Cathar faith. Seems like a merciful offer, right? But it wasn't. Because for the perfecti, for the true believers, renouncing their faith would be worse than death, so they didn't. 220 men and women, ordinary people like you and me, walked down the mountain, calmly, quietly. They were offered their lives in exchange for their souls. They chose their souls. And so on March 16th, 1244, a massive fire was built at the foot of Montségur. They were led into a wooden enclosure, tied, stacked together like wood. And they burned. No screaming, no resistance. Witnesses said the Cathars sang hymns as the flames took them. Can you imagine that kind of courage, that kind of peace? I can't. Not fully. But here's what I can do. I can remember them. And now, so can you. In the next part of this segment, we'll talk more about how Montségur became a symbol, a legend, a wound that never really healed. We'll also look at some of the individuals who made their final stand there, some whose names we still remember. But for now, just rest in this story. Let it settle into your mind. Not as noise, but as a whisper. The kind of whisper that echoes through time. Still with me? Still breathing slow? Good. If you're already lying down, maybe tucked under a soft blanket or letting your thoughts drift a bit, that's perfect. That's exactly what this part of the video is meant for. You can close your eyes whenever you want. You don't even have to keep listening closely. This story will stay here with you gently, like a quiet hum in the background of your dreams. We're still in segment 2 of this journey through the Cathar world, and this part is a bit more personal. Part 1 showed us the whole mountain, the siege, the flames, the sorrow. But now, I want to zoom in. Let's slow things down and talk about the people, the souls who made that climb up Mont Ségur and those who never came down again. Because history isn't just castles and kings and crusades, right? It's made up of people. Real, flawed, brave, scared, stubborn people. People like you. People like me. Let's start with one of the few names that still echoes from that mountain, Esclarmonde de Foix. Now the records are hazy, and historians argue about some of the details, but here's what we think we know. Esclarmonde was a noble woman, born into wealth, privilege, and power. But instead of clinging to that life, she walked away from it. She joined the Cathars, not as some fringe believer, but as a perfecter, one of the elite spiritual guides who took vows of purity and non-violence. She gave up luxury, gave up marriage, gave up comfort, all for a belief she couldn't shake. Now, pause with me for a moment and think about that. What would it take for you to give up everything you have right now? Your bed, your favorite meal, your friends, your safety? Could you do it? I don't think I could. Not easily. But Esclarmonde did. And she became a legend. Not because she was loud or violent, but because she was calm, consistent, centered. She wasn't at Mont Ségur when it fell, at least not according to most sources, but her presence still hovers there, like a ghost. Or maybe more like a memory held in the stones themselves. She represents the kind of belief that's quiet, but unshakable. And she wasn't alone. Another name you might hear is Pierre Bonnet, a Cathar perfectus who was rumored to have comforted others during the final days of the siege. No armor, no weapons, just words, just his voice. When the end came, it was said he helped guide others through the consolamentum, the Cathars' final spiritual rite, their version of a last confession, their preparation for death. But unlike the Catholic last rites, this wasn't about fear or repentance. It was about release. You know that feeling when you've carried something heavy all day and you finally set it down. That's what the consolamentum was meant to be. Not terror, just letting go. And now I want you to imagine the mood in that fortress during those last nights. The fire wasn't lit yet. The soldiers were still outside. But the air was thick with understanding. Everyone inside knew what was coming. And instead of running, instead of panicking, they prepared. Imagine it. There's candlelight flickering on the stone walls. Someone is boiling a pot of soup, probably thin, probably the last they have. Children whisper to each other. A mother braids her daughter's hair. A man sharpens a knife, not for battle, but maybe just for carving wood or preparing a meal. And in a quiet corner, a perfectus kneels with an old woman. He places a hand on her shoulder. He speaks softly, maybe not even words you'd understand. Can you feel that quiet, that kind of peace? Would you be able to sit still if you knew tomorrow was your last day? Now, I know this is supposed to be a sleep video, and you might be wondering, why are we talking about death so much? But that's the thing about these kinds of stories. They're not about death, they're about choosing how to live, even when you're trapped, even when you're outnumbered, even when the whole world says you're wrong. That's what the Cathars did. And that's what makes this moment in history feel strangely warm, like the last bit of light before sunset. Now I want to tell you something curious, almost like a side note. But maybe not. After the fall of Montségur, the Church declared victory. The heresy was wiped out. At least that's what the records say, but stories persisted. Whispers. Some people claimed that just before the surrender, a small group of Cathars slipped out of the fortress, maybe under the cover of night, maybe through some hidden path. They carried with them something sacred, something too precious to fall into enemy hands. Some said it was a book, others said a relic. Some even whispered the word Grail. Now, before you roll your eyes or think we're heading into Dan Brown territory, just pause. Because what matters isn't whether the relic existed. What matters is that people believed it did. They wanted to believe something survived, something holy, untouched. That even in the face of total defeat, the Cathars managed to save their truth. Isn't that a beautiful thought? That even when the world burned, something pure slipped through the cracks. It makes you wonder, what would you risk everything to protect? Is there anything in your life, an idea, a person, a piece of knowledge, that you'd carry through fire? That's the kind of question Montségur leaves behind. And that's why centuries later people still visit. They climb the mountain, they walk through the ruined walls, they touch the stones and wonder what voices once echoed there. Sometimes they even leave flowers. Sometimes they just sit, quietly, listening. And some say, you can still feel the presence of the ones who stayed behind. Not ghosts, not in a scary way, more like a memory that clings to the air. A kind of stillness, a kind of warmth, as if the mountain itself remembers. Have you ever visited a place like that? Somewhere that just feels heavy with story? Maybe a battlefield, maybe a family home, maybe a temple, or even just a quiet bench in an old park. History leaves fingerprints, and Montségur is full of them. Even now, archaeologists find bits and pieces, tools, bones, charred wood, arrowheads, and each one tells a piece of the story. Not the whole story, but just enough. Enough to keep us wondering. That's the power of remembering. Even centuries later, even when the names are blurred and the facts are uncertain, the feeling remains. A kind of solemn hush. And maybe that's why you're here, listening to this video. Maybe, like me, you find comfort in remembering the forgotten. It's not about glorifying the past. It's not about taking sides. It's about understanding that even the quietest people, the ones who never ruled empires or won battles, still mattered. The Cathars weren't powerful. They didn't have armies or cities, but they had something else: conviction, community, compassion. And in the end they had Montségur, their last stand, their quiet goodbye. In the next part, the final part of this segment, we'll take a step back and ask a broader question. What did the fall of Montségur really mean? For France? For the Church? For the future of Europe? We'll talk about the silence that followed, the myths that grew, and how the Cathars, even in death, left behind a legacy the Church couldn't quite erase. But for now, just rest with this: a mountain, a fire, a choice, and the echo of a people who whispered their truth, even as the world turned away. I'm really glad you stayed with me. This next part, this last stretch of our second segment, might be the quietest of them all. We're going to slow things down even more, if that's possible, You don't need to sit upright, you don't even need to stay awake. If your eyes are heavy or your body's already melting into the mattress, that's perfect. This part of the story, well, it's more like a whisper that lingers after everyone else has left the room. So let's gently step into the shadow of Montségur. Not the siege, not the screams or the fire. No, that's already past. This is the after. You ever think about what silence feels like after something huge ends? Like after a storm when the rain stops and everything is wet and heavy and still, or after a deep cry when your chest is sore but finally quiet. That's what southern France felt like after Montségur fell. Everything was quieter, almost too quiet. The church had won, if that's the word for it. The heresy had been rooted out. The crusade was over. The nobles who had protected the Cathars were punished or shamed into silence. The remaining Cathars, those who hadn't been killed, fled underground. Their places of worship disappeared. Their teachings were scattered like ash in the wind. But the memory, it clung. Have you ever noticed how when someone tries too hard to erase something, it kind of lingers even stronger in people's minds? That's what happened with the Cathars. The more the church tried to scrub them out of the history books, the more rumors crept in to fill the silence. Now let's talk about some of those whispers, because honestly, they're fascinating. Not long after the fall of Montségur, stories started to spread. Strange stories. Some said the Cathars weren't just heretics. They were keepers of a secret, something ancient, something powerful, and some said they escaped with it, that before the siege ended, a few Cathars disappeared into the mountains with a hidden treasure. And no, I don't mean gold or coins. People spoke of something far more mysterious. Some said it was sacred writings, books from the early days of Christianity, unedited, unfiltered, never touched by the hands of Rome. Others whispered about the Holy Grail. Yes, that Grail, the cup of Christ. Now I know, this sounds like something from a novel, but that's the strange thing about history. Sometimes the quieter a story gets, the more room there is for wonder to sneak in. And maybe that's the point. The Cathars didn't leave behind grand cathedrals or glittering tombs, but they left behind questions like, what if they really did know something the church didn't want anyone to hear? Or what if their quiet way of life, their simplicity, their equality, their refusal to kill, was actually something powerful enough to scare the most powerful institution in Europe? Wouldn't that be something? Have you ever known someone who lived so differently that it made other people uncomfortable? Not because they were wrong, but because they made people question their own lives. That was the Cathars. Even in death, they made people wonder. And so, the whispers grew. In the centuries that followed, Montségur became more than a ruin. It became a symbol, a kind of quiet beacon. People climbed the mountain, not just for the view, but for something else. Maybe they didn't even know what they were looking for, but they came anyway. Maybe that's how truth survives, not in books, but in footsteps, in memory, in longing. By the 20th century, writers, mystics, and even esoteric groups started to fixate on Montségur. Some claimed it was a site of hidden power. Others insisted it was a spiritual hotspot, like a European version of a sacred mountain. And still others came just to feel close to something old, something unspoken, and you know what? I kind of love that. I love that this quiet, tragic story about a people who refused to fight, who were burned for their beliefs, still echoes in such a strange way. Not with fanfare, not with monuments, but with soft fascination, with hushed voices and unanswered questions. Maybe that's the truest kind of history. The kind that keeps you up at night, not because it's loud, but because it's still whispering. And now that we've sat with that, let's come back to the people once again. Because after Montségur fell, not everyone disappeared. There were survivors, refugees, people who had believed in the Cathar teachings, but now had to pretend otherwise. They lived quiet lives. Some moved north, some blended into other Christian communities, and some held onto little scraps of memory. Do you think you'd be able to do that? To hide your deepest belief just to stay alive? That's not an easy thing, not at all. There's a kind of slow grief that comes with it, the kind that doesn't explode, but simmers for years, decades, maybe even generations. And yet, somehow that grief didn't erase the story. Because here we are talking about it, centuries later in the dark, in a world the Cathars could never have imagined. Sometimes I wonder if they knew their names would be remembered, even like this, quietly, gently. Do you think they'd feel comfort? I like to think so. And now, as we near the end of this segment, I want to leave you with a kind of meditation. Just a soft string of thoughts to fall asleep to. There's a mountain in southern France. It isn't the tallest, it isn't the grandest, but it holds a secret, a memory, a hush. The wind still blows through its ruined walls. The sky still stretches above it, pale and wide. Birds still nest in the crumbled stone. And somewhere in that silence a story waits. Not a loud one, not a heroic one, but a story that still matters. Because even the quietest voices deserve to be heard, and even the most forgotten places deserve to be remembered. So, as you drift or rest, or simply lie there thinking, just hold on to that. That maybe, somewhere in your life, there's a story waiting to be whispered. A truth you carry, a light you haven't named yet. You don't have to shout it. You don't have to prove anything. Just hold it gently. And maybe when the time is right, let someone else hear it too. Like we just heard the Cathars, still here. Still whispering, still remembered. So now that we've walked through what it was like to be a Cathar and sat quietly with their final moments at Montségur, let's do something a little different. Let's lean in closer. Let's put our ear to the ground and see what hums underneath the silence they left behind. This segment, we're calling it The Lost Gospel and the Hidden Bones. But don't worry, it's not a thriller. It's more like a very, very slow reveal. A candle-lit walk through a crumbling archive. Or maybe just a walk through the woods with a few strange clues under your feet. You ever wonder what gets left behind when a people vanish? I mean, not just the obvious stuff, ruins, burnt wood, abandoned stone buildings, but the things no one expects. A scratched word on a cave wall. A broken pendant in the dirt, a book that almost no one can read. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about tonight. Because the Cathars didn't just vanish, they faded, yes, they were erased, yes. But like we talked about before, as echoes are hard to kill, and over the centuries people started to look for those echoes, to search for what the Cathars left behind, not just in memory but in objects, in bones, in soil, in symbols. Let's start with a cave. Not a fancy cathedral, not a castle, just a cave. There's a place in the Languedoc region of southern France, near Ussat-les-Bains, where a network of caves stretches into the soft limestone hills. Locals call one of them the Grotte des Cathars, or the Cathar Cave. Now, we can't say for sure if the Cathars actually hid there, but there are stories. And more than stories, there are carvings, simple ones, crosses, letters, odd little spiral shapes. Some people say they're just the marks of passing shepherds or medieval wanderers, but others, they aren't so sure. What if this was a secret meeting place? A kind of underground chapel? That's the first thread we'll follow tonight. Because caves like these weren't just hiding spots. They were sacred, and they echo with mystery. Have you ever been in a real cave before? I mean deep inside, past the daylight, where it's so quiet your heartbeat feels like thunder. It changes you a little, slows you down, makes you feel ancient, even if you're just visiting. That's the kind of vibe we're chasing tonight. Now let's shift gears a little. Let's talk about something called the Book of the Two Principles. Ever heard of it? It's a text that scholars believe contains the core of Cathar theology, or at least one version of it. It's not written in fancy Latin. It doesn't sound like a church document. It's raw, it's bold. It talks about two creators, one good, one evil, and paints the world as a battlefield between them. Sound familiar? It should. It's the kind of dualism we touched on back in segment 1. But this book, it's almost mythical. It was found, copied, lost again, found again. Like it didn't want to be seen all at once. Kind of like the Cathars themselves. And here's where it gets weird. Some versions of the book contain references that sound is older than Christianity, older than medieval Europe. Scholars argue about this a lot, but some think the roots of Cathar beliefs stretch back to Persian religions like Zoroastrianism. Others say it's more Gnostic in flavor, like the early forbidden sects of Christianity that believed in hidden knowledge and spiritual awakening. Isn't that strange? How a little heretic group in medieval France might be carrying philosophical DNA from halfway around the world. And it makes you wonder, how far back does this rabbit hole go? Because here's a twist for you. Did you know there's a theory floated by some modern researchers that the Cathars were preserving not just a religion, but a memory? Like they were the caretakers of something even older. Something pre-Christian. We'll tread lightly here because history isn't always kind to mysteries. But the idea is this: the Cathars weren't inventing something new. They were trying to protect something ancient, something that the Roman Church had long since buried. Maybe a different version of the Christ story. Or maybe something even stranger, like a sacred tradition tied to the feminine divine. Now, I know what you might be thinking. How do we separate fact from fiction? How do we know what's real and what's just wishful thinking or myth-making? And honestly, that's the magic of this segment. We're not here to prove anything. We're here to drift through the shadows, to sit with the mystery, because mystery isn't a flaw in history. It's part of the design. Let me ask you something. Do you think some truths are meant to be hidden? Not because they're dangerous, but because they're sacred. It's okay if you don't have an answer. Just sit with the question. Now let's bring in another strange artifact, something quiet, something unassuming. A small stone carving. It was found near Montelieu, a tiny mountain village in the Pyrenees. You wouldn't even notice it if you walked by, but if you look closely, it shows a bird, wings outstretched, with what looks like a sun above its head. It's not labeled, no inscription, just the image. Now, a bird and a sun aren't unusual symbols, but some say it might represent the Holy Spirit. Reimagined in Cathar terms, a divine messenger not of judgment, but of release. A spirit that doesn't punish, but liberates. And the idea of liberation was central to Cathar belief. Remember the consolamentum, the one ritual they practiced. It wasn't about sin or guilt. It was about freeing the spirit from the prison of flesh. And maybe that's what the bird meant, a soul set free. That image stayed with me. Maybe it's staying with you too. Now let's take a soft turn. Let's talk about Montségur again. Not the siege, not the fire, just the ruins. Modern archaeologists have spent years climbing those stones, measuring, mapping, digging. And every so often they find something small. A ceramic shard, a coin, a fragment of cloth turned to dust. But the most interesting thing, they say the layout of the fortress, the way the rooms connect, the shape of the towers, the way the sunlight falls through certain windows, isn't typical of French fortresses at all. It's different, almost symbolic, almost like someone wanted the place to act as a kind of message, a spiritual structure, a space not just for defense but for ceremony, kind of like a temple. Do you think people build places for more than just walls and roofs? Do you think some places are meant to mean something? Me too. And Montségur, it meant something. Even now, if you visit, there's a strange stillness up there. Not scary, just deep, like the stone remembers. And here's the last thing I'll leave you with in this part. The idea that some of the Cathars survived longer than we thought. That even after Montségur, even after the Inquisition, small groups carried their teachings in secret, passed them down in stories, in songs, in whispered prayers that didn't sound quite Catholic but didn't look heretical either. And some researchers believe they left clues. Not obvious ones, just little signs. A carving on a church door that doesn't belong. A pattern in a tapestry that's just slightly off. A family name in the Languedoc that shows up in old Cathar registers and never quite disappears. Maybe you've seen something like that. A detail that doesn't fit. Something that tugs at your attention for no reason you can explain. That's the Cathars, still lingering, still whispering, still just out of reach. All right, so you're still with me. That's good. We're deep in segment 3 now, our mystery and culture deep dive. You've probably gotten real comfy by now, maybe even a little sleepy. That's perfect. This is the part where we settle even deeper into the folds of history. The folds where facts blur into stories, and stories start to feel like dreams. You don't have to remember everything. Just let the images come to you like fog rolling down a mountain. So far we've wandered through caves, we've brushed ancient stones with our fingertips, and we've followed half-buried clues left behind by a people who refused to leave quietly. Now I want to explore something that's a little harder to touch, but no less real. Let's talk about symbols. You ever notice how symbols seem to survive even when everything else is lost? Languages change, buildings collapse, empires fall, but symbols, somehow, they keep going. Sometimes they sneak into places where you least expect them. One symbol that's often connected to the Cathars is the Perfecti cross, a kind of simple, slender cross with equal arms, sometimes surrounded by a circle. But here's the thing. This cross doesn't look like the crucifix you're used to seeing. It doesn't have a body on it. No suffering Christ, just balance, simplicity. Some have even suggested that it represents the sun or the wheel, ancient symbols of eternity and cosmic cycles. Now you won't find this cross officially labeled Cathar in museums. That would be too easy. Instead, you find echoes of it. in carvings on old door lintels in Occitan villages, in patterns on shepherd staffs, even in the stained glass of rural churches that were once Catholic, then Protestant, and now just quiet buildings with dusty pews and no one left to remember who carved what and why. Makes you wonder, did some local artisans hide their beliefs in plain sight? Here's a fun question to think about. If you had to hide your deepest belief in a way that would survive time, no books, no language, just a shape, what would you carve? And where would you hide it? Let's shift for a moment and talk about something even murkier, oral tradition. We tend to think of history as what gets written down, but you know as well as I do, some of the most powerful stories are the ones passed from person to person, quietly, like a secret. In the old villages of the Languedoc, people used to tell bedtime stories to their children, softly around fires or whispered at dusk. And sometimes those stories included characters who sounded a lot like Cathar perfecti, gentle, wandering figures who healed the sick, fed the hungry, and carried nothing but a walking staff and strange words. Were they just fairy tales? Or were they distant echoes of a real memory? A memory softened and reshaped by time. There's one tale from the Ariège region, a little mountain story that's been told for generations. It speaks of a man in black robes who would come down from the hills once every full moon to speak to the animals. The villagers said he understood the birds and the wolves, that he never aged, that he only spoke to those who were very ill or very sad. Some people said he was a ghost, others said he was an angel, but there's an odd detail in the story. They say he always refused to enter the church. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The Cathars believed that physical churches weren't sacred. They believed that you, the person, the spirit inside, was the true temple. So maybe this story about the man in the hills is just a folk legend. But maybe, just maybe, it's a myth wrapped around the memory of a real person. A perfectus who survived longer than anyone realized. Let's talk about another piece of the puzzle. Something that's often mentioned with a raised eyebrow and a whispered tone. The Holy Grail. Yeah, I know. It sounds like we're drifting into fantasy now, Monty Python, Indiana Jones, all of that. But stay with me. We're not looking for a literal cup. We're asking a deeper question. What if the Holy Grail wasn't a cup at all? What if it was a symbol of hidden knowledge? Some researchers, especially those fascinated by the Cathars, believe that the Grail legends were deeply connected to the Languedoc region. The earliest versions of the Grail story were written in Occitan, not Latin, and some of the imagery overlaps with Cathar beliefs. Purity, inner light, and a kind of spiritual nourishment that can't be explained with bread and wine. It's all very dreamy, I know, but here's a twist. There's an old legend that says the Grail was hidden at Montségur, that just before the final siege, a group of Cathars slipped out under the cover of darkness and carried something precious away, something that had to be protected. Now, was it really a cup? Probably not. But could it have been a manuscript? A relic? A symbol? Maybe. What would you want to save if your entire world was about to be burned to the ground? It's a haunting thought. And even if the legend isn't true, the fact that people believed it tells us something. It tells us that the Cathars left behind not just a memory, but a mystery. And humans, well, we're wired to follow mysteries, especially the quiet ones. Let's zoom back in for a moment. There's a small town in modern-day southern France called Rennes-le-Château. It's famous among mystery lovers for a different story, one about a priest who may have found a secret treasure. The details are murky, the connections to the Cathars are weak, but you know what? People still go there, still wander through the hills with metal detectors and maps, still whisper about buried manuscripts and secret bloodlines. And while the historical facts are shaky, the feeling is undeniable. There's something about this land, this region. It holds on to mystery, like the soil itself remembers. Maybe you've felt that in other places. Old cities, ruins, cemeteries. Some places just hum with memory. Let's turn now to something a little more grounded. Language. Specifically, the Occitan language. This was the tongue spoken by the Cathars. It's soft, lyrical, and full of nuance, not quite French, not quite Spanish. It has its own flavor, and it was the language of troubadours, of love poetry, of song. But it was also the language of heresy. After the Crusade, the Church tried to wipe it out. Latin was enforced in churches, French was taught in schools. Occitan became the language of peasants, of whispers, of songs sung under the breath. But guess what? It's still alive. Not everywhere, not loudly, but in some villages, some families still speak it, still sing in it, and scholars have spent decades collecting Occitan songs and poems that may contain coded references to Cathar beliefs. Isn't that beautiful? A banned religion surviving in lullabies. Think about that for a moment. While kings and popes fought wars, mothers were rocking their babies to sleep with melodies that carried traces of forbidden light. Do you think culture can survive without being written down? Can music carry belief? I think so. Let's end this part with something small, a legend. No big explosions, just a gentle ripple. There's a well tucked into a forest clearing near Foix. It's hard to find. No signs. Just a ring of stones and a cool pool of water. Local stories say that during the Inquisition, a Cathar woman hid there. That she drank from the well every day, never speaking, never leaving. That she glowed faintly at night. That animals gathered near her, as if drawn to her peace. Eventually, they say, she disappeared. No bones, no grave. Just gone. The well is still there, and people say if you drink from it, you'll dream of light. Now, whether you believe that or not, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that people remember, and remembering is a kind of resistance, isn't it? That's what the Cathars left behind. Not just relics, not just ruins, but a kind of soft resistance. A quiet refusal to be erased. A whisper that keeps echoing. And I think maybe that's what makes their mystery so powerful. It's not about what we know, it's about what refuses to be forgotten. We've come a long way together in this story. I hope you're still feeling cozy, tucked in, eyes getting a little heavy, because this last part of segment 3, it's meant to feel like a slow descent into a dream, a gentle drift down through the final layers of history, memory, and myth. And hey, before we go any deeper, can I ask you something? Have you ever had the feeling that some places are watching you? Not in a creepy way, more like they're old quiet observers, forests, caves, ruins. It's almost as if they're just waiting for someone to remember what they used to be. We're going to end our mystery and culture deep dive with a walk. Not a real one, but an imagined one. So close your eyes if you haven't already, or just let your mind wander. Imagine we're walking through a remote patch of the Languedoc countryside. It's early evening, maybe right after a summer rain. The ground is soft, the air is thick with the smell of thyme and wet stone. We come across a path. Not really a trail, just the ghost of one. A little worn, a little overgrown. You might not notice it if you weren't looking carefully, but we follow it. Slowly, step by step. And then we see it. A cave. Not a big, dramatic cave. Just a quiet mouth in the hillside like the earth exhaling. The kind of place where stories like to hide. These caves, real ones by the way, dot the region all around Montségur and Foix. They were shelters, hiding places, secret temples. The Cathars called them grottes sacrées, sacred grottos. Inside, it's cool, damp. The air smells of minerals and moss, and if we shine a light on the walls, what do you think we'd see? Maybe faint carvings, circles, crosses, strange geometric patterns that don't look quite Catholic, but don't look pagan either. Some people believe the Cathars used these symbols to meditate, that the caves were more than just hiding places, they were spiritual sanctuaries. Isn't that fascinating? Imagine that. A religion so at odds with the dominant powers that its followers had to go underground, literally, to find peace. Would you be willing to go that far for what you believe? Would I? Let's step a little further in. There's a legend tied to one particular cave near Ussat-les-Bains. Locals say that during the Inquisition, a small group of perfecti took refuge inside. They lived there for weeks, maybe months. They fasted, prayed, slept on stone. And according to the stories, one night during a full moon they all disappeared. Not captured, not killed, just gone. Some say they ascended. Others say they found a passage deeper into the earth. A secret place. A sanctuary untouched by time. And even if it's just a legend, isn't it a beautiful one? That maybe, just maybe, there are still places in the world where people can vanish not in fear but in peace. Now you might be wondering, how much of this can we really know? And the truth is, not much. That's the thing about mystery. The more you try to shine a light on it, the more it slips away. But sometimes you don't need answers. Sometimes it's enough just to sit with the wonder, to let the not knowing wrap around you like a blanket. In that spirit, let's explore something else. Let's talk about continuity theories. The idea that the Cathars didn't vanish entirely, but that their ideas survived quietly in other forms. Some researchers have tried to trace a line from the Cathars to later mystical movements. The Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, the Theosophists, even certain strands of modern spirituality. Now, I'm not saying those connections are proven. Most scholars roll their eyes at this kind of thing. But you and I, we're just dreaming here, right? Just letting our minds drift through the fog. And when you look at the patterns, shared beliefs about inner light, the rejection of materialism, the emphasis on purity, it does make you wonder. What if the Cathar spirit didn't die? What if it just changed clothes? Have you ever met someone who seemed out of place in time? Like they were carrying something old inside them, something that didn't quite match the modern world? Maybe that's what continuity looks like. Not big secret societies or hidden treasures. Just people, quietly living with a light that refuses to go out. And speaking of light, let's end with a final story. This one's modern. It happened just a few years ago. A traveler, let's call him Luke, was hiking in the Ariège. He wasn't looking for Cathar ruins or religious experiences. He was just hiking, clearing his head. But he got lost, took a wrong turn. His phone died, and after a few hours he started to panic. The sun was going down. No signal, no trail. And then, just as the last light was fading, he stumbled across a stone archway, a little crumbled, overgrown, but unmistakably man-made. He ducked under it and found a staircase, old, mossy, worn smooth by centuries of feet. Luke followed the stairs down into a hollow, a shallow grotto surrounded by stone walls. In the center, a single bench carved from rock, and beside it, a small flame. Not a torch, not a fire, just a flame, flickering, no visible source. Luke swears it wasn't a trick of the light, that he sat there for what felt like hours just breathing, watching the flame, and that when he finally stood to leave, he felt different, lighter, calmer. He tried to find the place again, many times, but he never could. Was it real? Was it imagination? Or was it something in between? We may never know. But stories like that, they stick with you. They glow in the dark corners of your mind, like that little flame. So maybe that's the real legacy of the Cathars. Not facts, not relics, but feelings. That quiet sense that truth isn't always loud, that mystery matters, that peace can be radical, that even in the darkest times, someone somewhere is holding on to light. And maybe, just maybe, you're part of that light too. Now take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let the history blur into dream. And when you're ready, we'll move on to the final segment. One last contrast. One last peek into the other side of this story. Not the heretics in caves, but the ones who hunted them. You ready for that? Maybe not just yet. That's okay. We'll be here when you are. Welcome to segment 4. We've come such a long way together through this story, haven't we? You've walked the dusty paths of Cathar villages. You've sat beside the ruins. You've peeked into caves and mysteries, drifted through sacred stories. And now we're going to flip the mirror, shift the angle. Because the Cathars didn't exist in a vacuum. They were shaped, pushed, pursued, and ultimately wiped out by forces bigger than themselves. Forces with wealth, armies, cathedrals. Forces that didn't need to hide in caves. So let's take a deep breath and gently lift the curtain on the other side of the story. The world of the powerful, the church, the nobles, the inquisitors, not in a judgmental way, not to fan any flames, but just to understand. Because that contrast, it's where a lot of the truth lives. You ready? Okay, let's go back in time. Imagine it's the early 1200s again, but instead of standing barefoot in a Cathar village, let's say you're in a hall, a great hall, stone walls, tapestries, candlelight flickering against wooden beams. You're wearing layers, velvet maybe, fur-lined. Your hands are clean, your boots are leather. You smell of perfume, not smoke. You're not a heretic tonight. You're a bishop, or a nobleman, or the educated scribe sitting at the edge of the room, quill in hand, recording everything. And in this world, your world, things are very different. Let's talk about the church first. Now I want you to remember something. The Catholic Church in the 13th century wasn't just a spiritual body. It was a political machine, a landowner, a court, a kingmaker. in some regions more powerful than the actual kings. And with that power came enormous responsibility and temptation. The church had grown vast, with priests and bishops and archbishops and abbots and monasteries scattered across Europe like stars across the sky. But with all that growth, something had shifted. Do you ever feel like big institutions over time start to lose touch with the people they were supposed to serve? That's how it felt to many in Languedoc. While Cathar perfecti were living in simplicity, barefoot, refusing even to swat a fly, church officials were often living in wealth. Gold chalices, embroidered robes, lavish feasts. Power that wasn't just spiritual, it was economic and political. And people noticed. That dissonance, it opened the door for alternative voices, but from the church's point of view. The Cathars weren't just critics, they were dangerous. Let's say you're a bishop sitting in that candlelit hall. You've spent your life rising through the ranks. You've studied theology. You believe in order, structure, sacrament. You see the church as the body of Christ on earth, flawed but holy. Then you hear about a movement growing in your territory, preachers without permission, rejecting the sacraments, saying the material world is evil, teaching that marriage is a trap, that the church is corrupt. What do? Do you debate them? Do you ignore them? Or do you eventually move to silence them? That's what Pope Innocent III chose to do. He didn't start with violence, not at first. He sent missionaries, letters, envoys, tried to bring the Cathars back into the fold, but it didn't work. And then something terrible happened. A papal envoy, a man named Pierre de Castelnau, was murdered in 1208. No one really knows who did it, but the blame fell on the Cathars, and that was it. That was the spark. That's when Innocent III called for a crusade, not to the Holy Land, but right here in Europe, the Albigensian Crusade, a holy war against fellow Christians. Let that sink in for a moment. Can you imagine what it felt like for the church to turn its military power inward? To unleash armies on French soil, not to defend but to destroy? Now let's talk about those who answered the call. Not just monks and priests, but nobles, knights, mercenaries. A whole generation of warriors promised land, wealth, and salvation if they joined the fight. Do you remember Simon de Montfort? He's worth sitting with for a minute. Tall, charismatic, ruthless. A nobleman from northern France who took command of the crusade. He didn't just lead battles, he reshaped the map. Where once there were semi-independent lords in Languedoc, tolerant of the Cathars, suddenly there was conquest. Sieges, executions, burnings. Simon was a man on a mission, and in his wake, villages burned, castles fell, entire communities were displaced. There's a story, probably embellished over the years, about the siege of Béziers. When asked how to distinguish between Catholics and Cathars in the city, a church official supposedly said, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether or not that quote is real, the massacre was. Thousands were killed. Can you picture the silence after that kind of violence? The way ash settles into the cracks of stone? Now we could keep going down that road. The campaigns, the sieges, the treaties. But instead I want to slow down again, take you into a different space. Let's talk about the Inquisition. Have you ever wondered what it was really like? Not the caricature, not the horror movie version, but the day-to-day experience? Because after the crusade ended, after the Cathar strongholds had been crushed, the church realized something. The ideas hadn't disappeared, so they created an institution to root them out. The Inquisition. Not knights with swords this time, but men with questions, tables, ledgers, silence. Imagine being called to testify, you're not sure what for. Maybe someone whispered that you refused to eat meat on a feast day. Maybe you were seen speaking with a known heretic. You're taken to a quiet chamber. No windows. A Dominican friar sits across from you. He's not angry, he doesn't shout. He just asks and waits. He wants names, meetings, details. And if you lie, he'll know. And if you don't lie, others might suffer. It wasn't always torture, but it was always fear. And here's the contrast. The Cathars had no prisons, no police, no punishments. If you didn't agree with them, you could leave. But the church, it had structure, authority, and a very clear sense of what counted as dangerous. Do you think you would have stayed silent, or would you have spoken out? It's hard to say, isn't it? Now let's widen the lens again, back to the elite, the aristocrats. Not all of them supported the crusade. In fact, many lords in Languedoc were sympathetic to the Cathars. They hosted debates, offered protection, believed in tolerance, at least until that became too dangerous. But over time, that autonomy eroded. Power was centralized. Territories were absorbed into the French crown, and the world of Montségur, of the independent-minded South, was slowly overwritten. So here's the big question I've been circling toward. What does it say about a society when its most powerful institutions are willing to destroy their own people to maintain control? And what does it say about the people who resist? We'll keep exploring that in the next parts of this final segment. But for now, I want to ask you something softer. Are you still with me? Are you maybe feeling the edges of sleep brushing against your thoughts? Good. Because history isn't just what happened. It's how it feels in your bones when you hear it. So stay cozy, stay curious. And when you're ready, we'll move on to part 2 of this segment, where we'll look more closely at the inner life of these elites. The monks, the abbots, the ones who believed they were doing God's will, even when that meant setting fire to others. It's a difficult journey, but I promise we'll take it gently, and always together. You're still here with me, aren't you? Maybe you're curled up, maybe you've dimmed the lights, maybe your eyes are already halfway closed. That's totally fine. Whether you're wide awake or drifting a little, just let the words flow over you, like a slow-moving river. Because we're not done yet, not by a long shot. We're still in segment 4, and this is part 2. If you remember, last time we started exploring the other side of the Cathar story. Not the peasants, not the heretics in hiding, but the powerful people, the elite, the men of God, the ones in robes and towers, the ones holding the keys to the kingdoms and the cathedrals, the ones who, whether through fear or faith or force, helped bring the Cathars to their knees. And in this part, I want to go deeper into their world, their beliefs, their choices, because history, even when it's brutal, isn't always driven by villains twirling mustaches. Sometimes it's about conviction, about certainty, and sometimes that's the most dangerous thing of all. Let's start with the monks, the Dominicans especially. Now just close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It's early morning and the bells are ringing across the stone corridors of a monastery. You wake up on a wooden cot. Your breath puffs in the cold air. You've got calloused hands, maybe, from copying manuscripts all day. Your robes are simple, no jewelry, no comforts. You live in silence for much of the day. You pray, you fast, you study. This is your life. And if you're a Dominican friar in the 13th century, this isn't just a calling, it's a mission. You believe you've been chosen to protect the truth, to defend the faith from false teachings, to guard the souls of the flock. Now let me ask you something. If you truly believed that someone's soul could burn for eternity because they followed the wrong doctrine, wouldn't you try to stop them? Even if it meant using harsh methods. That's the heart of this paradox. You see, many of the inquisitors weren't sadists. They weren't cartoon villains. They were theologians, scholars, men of prayer. And in their minds, Catharism wasn't just wrong, it was lethal. Not to the body, but to the soul. And that changes things, doesn't it? From the outside, the Inquisition looks like a machine of control, and it was. But from the inside, it might have felt like a rescue mission. I mean, imagine you're a young Dominican. You've just been assigned to a region that was once full of Cathars. You're told to root out heresy. You study the Cathar texts. You memorize their arguments. You learn how to debate them, how to challenge their logic. And then one day someone from the village whispers a name, a woman. She's old, harmless, but she never eats meat, never attends mass. She's been seen talking to strangers. You pay her a visit. You sit in her cottage. There's a quiet fire. She looks at you like she's not afraid. She even offers you tea. What do? Do you see a rebel? Or a lost soul? Or maybe a mirror? See, that's the complexity that gets lost in the big, bold strokes of history. These weren't black and white roles. The Inquisitor and the heretic were sometimes neighbors, sometimes even family. Some Dominicans even began to question their own role. There are records, scattered, faded, of friars who walked away, who felt conflicted, who chose silence over prosecution. Isn't that something? But let's not romanticize the whole thing either, because while some inquisitors were thoughtful, others absolutely wielded their power like a hammer. And the structure itself, the rules, the secrecy, the fear, it created space for cruelty, even if that wasn't the original goal. Now, shift with me for a moment. Let's move from the monastery to the palace, to the court of a noble, a powerful man. He's not a priest, he's a politician. Maybe he fought in the crusade. Maybe he took Cathar land as spoils. Maybe he's hosting a banquet tonight. Roasted meat, fine wine, minstrels playing. And across from him sits a bishop in velvet robes, holding a goblet, laughing at some courtly joke. Can you picture it? This is the other kind of power, the secular, the feudal, the kind that shapes borders, makes alliances, marries daughters to dukes. And in this world, Catharism wasn't just a spiritual threat. It was political instability. It was defiance. It was bad for business. Do you think they cared about theology? Some of them, sure, but many just wanted order, control, a single authority to keep things clean. You see, the nobles of northern France didn't just fight because of faith. They saw an opportunity. Southern France was wealthy, independent, different, and that made it vulnerable. So, the church and the crown made a kind of pact. The church would bless the war, and the nobility would carry it out. Land was seized, castles handed over, titles changed hands, and in the process, the culture of Languedoc, the tolerance, the troubadours, the old ways, was slowly buried. Do you ever wonder what gets lost in the shuffle of history? Not just lives, but languages, songs, recipes, traditions. That's the quiet kind of loss that doesn't make headlines, but it matters. So now, let's move again. One last shift, just for tonight. Let's talk about the clergy, the bishops, the ones who oversaw entire regions. These were men of power and pageantry. They traveled with entourages, they consecrated churches, they sat on councils and influenced kings. And many of them, like Bishop Fulques of Toulouse, took the fight against the Cathars very seriously. Fulques was once a troubadour himself, a man of music and poetry, but he converted, became a bishop, and turned his energy to stamping out heresy. That's a complicated story, isn't it? A poet turned persecutor, a singer turned censor. What do you think changed in him? Was it fear, conviction, pressure? Or maybe he truly believed he was saving his people? That's the thing with history. You can never really know someone's heart. You can only follow their actions. And Fulques acted boldly. He supported the crusade, collaborated with Simon de Montfort, helped implement inquisitorial methods. And through his hands, whether he meant to or not, thousands were silenced. Is it possible to do evil in the name of good? That's not a rhetorical question. I really mean it. What do you think? Because that's what keeps echoing through this whole story. From the Pope in Rome to the friar in the village to the knight at the gates of Montségur, many of them believed they were doing the right thing. They weren't sneering villains. They were men caught in the gears of a larger machine. And the tragedy is that their certainty left no room for doubt, no space for dissent, no ear for the gentle voices who simply saw the world differently. So here's where I want to leave you for tonight, with a thought. The world of the Cathars was built on simplicity, on renunciation, on quiet resistance. The world of the elite was built on structure, authority, and a deep belief in their own rightness. And somewhere in between those two worlds was everyone else. The bakers, the midwives, the children, the farmers, caught between fire and altar. And maybe, just maybe, the lesson isn't about who was right, but about what happens when power stops listening. Are you still with me? Or are you gently drifting? Either way, it's okay. You've made it so far through this journey, and I'm honored to have walked beside you. Next, we'll head into part 3, the final piece of this segment, where we'll take a broader look at how all of this affected the ordinary people. Those who weren't Cathar, weren't crusader, weren't bishop or inquisitor, just people, living, surviving, witnessing it all. But for now, take a breath, sink into the quiet, and if you're ready, I'll be right here. Maybe you've been drifting in and out of sleep, half awake and half somewhere else entirely. That's fine, that's kind of the goal, right? Just let yourself float while the story keeps going. I've got you. We've come so far, haven't we? This is segment 4, part 3. The last part of this long, strange, very human story we've been whispering our way through. And this time, we're not following popes or inquisitors or heretics. No high towers, no burning stakes, no big proclamations. Just life. The soft, steady, quiet kind of life. Because between the dramatic moments of history, between the clashes of armies and the declarations of faith, there were people just trying to live, just trying to make bread, find shelter, raise kids, and sleep through the night without too much fear. You know, like you maybe, or someone you love. So let's settle in and talk about them. Can you picture a village in 13th century Languedoc? Stone cottages, dusty lanes, chickens wandering between gardens, A bakery with the smell of warm, coarse bread drifting out in the morning. Children chasing each other around a well. A woman bent over with firewood. A man tending his vines. Now imagine that village caught in the middle. Some neighbors are Cathars. They speak softly about the evil in the world, about how we should give up everything and live simply. They fast. They help the sick. They refuse to lie. Other neighbors are devout Catholics. They go to Mass. They kneel in confession. They cross themselves at the sound of bells. Maybe some of them worry about the Cathars. Maybe they say nothing. And then there are the rest. The ones who don't really know what they believe, who just want to be left alone, who fear both sides, who say as little as possible. Do you ever wonder what that felt like? To be afraid to say the wrong thing? To watch a neighbor disappear after a quiet knock at night? To have two men in robes, one Cathar, one Dominican, each tell you your soul depends on agreeing with them? That tension, that pressure, that constant walking on eggshells, it must have been exhausting. Let's say you're a baker in that village. You get up before dawn. You knead dough with aching hands. You watch the flour supplies carefully because a bad harvest means tighter loaves. Now maybe a Cathar parfait comes by. He won't take food from you, not if you use animal fat. He thanks you but refuses. You respect him. He's kind, gentle. He never judges. But he never laughs either. His eyes are always tired. Later, a Catholic priest comes by. He blesses your work, but he warns you about your neighbor. Says heresy is spreading. Says you should report anything suspicious. What do? Who do you believe? Or do you keep your head down, make your bread, and hope no one notices you? That's the thing. These weren't people who wanted to take sides. They were just trying to survive. They didn't want to be martyrs or judges. They just wanted peace. But peace wasn't easy to come by. And that's where this gets even more heartbreaking. Because in these communities, tight-knit and interwoven, violence didn't always come from outside. Sometimes it came from within. Imagine a young woman named Alice. Her mother was a Cathar. Her father was Catholic. She grows up hearing two kinds of prayers, two versions of truth. She keeps her doubts to herself. One day, the Inquisition comes to town. They ask questions, and someone, maybe out of fear or guilt or self-preservation, names Alice as a suspect. Maybe it's her cousin or her neighbor. Just imagine that. Imagine what it feels like to be turned in by someone you shared meals with. Someone who helped you carry firewood in the winter. That's what the Inquisition did to communities. It created a culture of suspicion. People stopped trusting, stopped talking, stopped singing even. You ever notice how silence can say more than words? It's like a whole village holding its breath. And the fear didn't just end with the Inquisition. After the Cathars were defeated, after the last strongholds were broken and the bonfires cooled, the region wasn't left to heal. It was reshaped, rewritten. Catholicism was enforced. Local customs were suppressed. The language, Occitan, was pushed aside in favor of French. It wasn't just about erasing heresy. It was about rewriting identity. And through all of that, ordinary people kept living. They married, had children, buried loved ones, held on to small joys where they could. Maybe they whispered old songs when no one was listening. Maybe they passed down stories to their grandchildren, quietly, cautiously. And over time, those stories became the only trace of what was lost. Have you ever heard a lullaby that feels older than memory? That's what survived. Not the books, not the cathedrals, but the hum of something remembered. Now let's pause a second. Let's step back, because I want to ask you something again. What do you think justice looks like? Not in a courtroom, not in theory, but in a village like the one we just described. Do you think justice was served when the Cathars were silenced? Do you think the ordinary people felt safer, or just more afraid? And here's another question. If you were living then, which side would you have chosen? Would you have taken the risk to follow the Cathars, even knowing it could cost you everything? Or would you have kept your beliefs hidden, buried under layers of caution? It's not an easy answer, is it? And that's what makes history so real, so human. Because it's not just dates and events. It's fear, doubt, love, hunger, hope. It's the smell of bread in the morning and the silence after the knock on the door. It's everything we feel now, just wearing different clothes. So here we are, at the end of this long, winding road. We've walked with heretics and friars, with lords and laborers. We've watched ideals rise and fall, and now we're standing in the quiet aftermath. And what's left? What do we take from this? Maybe a little more humility, a little more care with certainty. Because when people believe they are absolutely right, when they stop listening, stop asking, stop wondering, that's when harm finds its way in. And maybe, just maybe, the people who lived in those villages, the ones who tried to keep their heads down, who sang when they could, who loved and hurt and hoped quietly, they have something to teach us about resilience, about gentleness, about holding on to what matters even when the world demands you let it go. So, as we close this chapter, I want to thank you. Yes, you, the one still listening. Whether you're cozy in bed or just resting your eyes on a quiet afternoon, thank you for coming with me on this journey. I hope you felt something, learned something, or maybe just found a little peace in the rhythm of the past. And if your eyes are still open, maybe let them drift closed now. There's nothing else you need to do, nothing else to worry about. Just breathe. And if you find yourself wondering, what happened next? What stories still remain? Don't worry. There's always more. The past is a vast, endless landscape, and I'll be here ready to walk with you through it again. Quietly, carefully, one forgotten life at a time. Good night.